December 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium. Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's commando extraordinary, a man whose exploits had already become legend, rescuing Mussolini, Operation Oak, orchestrating the abduction of Miklos Horthy Jr. in Budapest, now found himself shivering in a captured American Jeep, its engines sputtering on a blend of desperation and low-octane German ersatz fuel. His mission, Operation Grafe, was ambitious, audacious, a spearhead of English-speaking Germans, disguised in American uniforms and vehicles, to sow chaos behind Allied lines, seize bridges over the Meuse, and generally disorient the enemy. He was a master of the impossible, or so he believed. His men, fluent in American slang, practiced driving Sherman tanks and dodging imaginary P-47s. Their equipment, however, was a cruel joke. Captured American uniforms were often too small or too large, their jeeps and half-tracks barely held together, scavenged from fallen foes, their engines hungry for the high-octane Allied fuel, a fuel Germany simply no longer possessed in any meaningful quantity. The biting cold was a constant companion, seeping into every threadbare uniform, every unheated bunker. The snow, thick and unforgiving, muffled the sounds of artillery, but amplified the gnawing emptiness in the stomachs of his men. This was not the blitzkrieg of 1940. This was a brutal, slow-motion crawl towards an unknown, yet increasingly inevitable end. Skorzeny, a man who had always thrived on the edge, felt the dull throb of desperation for the first time. The vast, mechanized war machine that was the United States, a force his propaganda ministry dismissed as soft, materialistic, and weak, was about to deliver a lesson in industrial realities that would reshape his understanding of conflict forever. The very air he breathed seemed to carry the metallic tang of an insurmountable logistical challenge, a truth far more devastating than any bullet or bomb. The American offensive had been relentless, a continuous grinding advance that consumed territory and resources with a terrifying efficiency. Skorzeny had seen the intelligence reports, of course. The staggering figures of American war production had been filtering through, dismissed by the High Command as Allied exaggerations, propaganda designed to demoralize. But seeing was believing, and what Skorzeny was about to see would strip away every last vestige of self-deception. It was during the final desperate push through the Ardennes, a gamble Hitler had staked his last reserves upon, that Skorzeny received a new urgent directive. His men, disguised as American military police, had successfully infiltrated a small Belgian village, their objective to secure a crucial crossroads. They had encountered minimal resistance, the Americans having fallen back in the initial shock of the offensive. What they discovered, however, was not strategic high ground or a communications hub, but something far more potent, more revelatory, an abandoned American fuel depot. Not just a few barrels, not a temporary cache, but a vast, sprawling collection of steel drums, neatly stacked, stretching out into the snow-covered fields like an endless metallic forest. Corporal Franz Stahler, a former Bavarian mechanic now wearing the uniform of a U.S. Army private, was the first to report back, his voice a strange mix of awe and disbelief over the crackling radio. "Obersturmbannführer," he stammered, "the Americans. They left behind a mountain of fuel. It's unbelievable." Skorzeny, initially skeptical, ordered a full reconnaissance. He suspected a trap, a deliberately abandoned booby-trapped illusion. But as more reports flooded in, detailing the sheer scale of the discovery, a cold dread began to replace his initial suspicion. He drove to the location himself, bypassing the usual German convoys, his stolen jeep a silent infiltrator. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. Row upon row, column after column, of olive-drab fuel drums emblazoned with the familiar white star, each one containing 55 gallons of high-octane gasoline. His eyes, accustomed to the meticulously rationed, often adulterated fuel supplies of the Wehrmacht, could not fully comprehend the abundance. It was an embarrassment of riches, a logistical miracle to German eyes. His men, initially cautious, quickly descended into a frenzy of activity, hooking up siphons, filling their own sputtering vehicles, and then, under Skorzeny's direct order, preparing to transport as much as possible back to German lines. The irony was not lost on him. Hitler's desperate offensive, launched in part due to a critical fuel shortage, was now being sustained, however briefly, by the very enemy they sought to defeat. The precise amount of fuel liberated that day was staggering to the German forces, nearly 50,000 gallons. For Skorzeny, it was less a victory and more a profound, unsettling revelation. He watched his men, their faces grimed with grease and snow, tirelessly siphoning the golden liquid, their movements reflecting a desperate hunger. He saw their gaunt faces, their ill-fitting uniforms, and then he looked at the drums, clean, uniformly stacked, part of an apparently limitless supply. It was a stark, almost obscene contrast. Germany's entire war machine was fueled by a complex, increasingly fragile network of synthetic fuel plants, often bombed into craters, or by meager reserves from occupied territories. The average German panzer division on the Eastern Front, at this stage of the war, might receive a few thousand gallons for a major offensive, carefully husbanded, meticulously accounted for. Here, the Americans had simply left behind what amounted to an entire German Army Corps' worth of fuel, as if it were a casual oversight, a minor inconvenience. This wasn't just a tactical gain. It was a glimpse into a parallel reality. The sheer casualness of the American abundance spoke volumes. It wasn't that they couldn't defend it. It was that they simply didn't need it as desperately. For Skorzeny, a man who understood the mechanics of war down to the last nut and bolt, this wasn't just gasoline. It was a liquid manifestation of industrial might, a flowing testament to an enemy's inexhaustible capacity. He estimated that a single U.S. Army division consumed more fuel in a week than some entire German fronts did in a month. This wasn't merely a disparity. It was a chasm. This specific incident, this single overwhelming cache of fuel, became a physical symbol of the strategic imbalance. He knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the Ardennes winter that his own nation's entire war effort was running on fumes, while the enemy, a nation they had derided as incapable of sustained military effort, was literally swimming in the very lifeblood of mechanized warfare. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Germany could never outproduce, outsupply, or outfuel an enemy capable of abandoning such a treasure without a second thought. The war, for Skorzeny, was no longer about audacious raids or tactical genius. It was about the cold, hard, unyielding arithmetic of industrial output. The realization settled upon Skorzeny like a shroud. This was not a war of cunning or courage anymore, though both were still necessary. It was a war of factories, of oil wells, of logistical networks stretching across oceans. And in that arena, Germany was hopelessly outmatched. He recalled the endless debates in Berlin, the desperate appeals to the Führer for more resources, more fuel, more steel. Hitler's grand visions, his pronouncements of ultimate victory, now seemed like the hollow echoes of a madman. Skorzeny had personally witnessed the desperate measures taken by the German war machine. Tanks running on wood gas, trucks fueled by synthetic mixtures that corroded engines, pilots flying combat missions with barely enough fuel to get back to base. He remembered seeing Messerschmitt Tu-62 jet fighters, revolutionary weapons that could have turned the tide, grounded for lack of fuel, their sophisticated engines idled by the crude reality of an oil deficit. The contrast with the American depot was so stark as to be almost surreal. 50,000 gallons, casually left behind. It spoke of an industrial capacity that defied the very concept of scarcity. How could one fight an enemy whose logistical tail was so vast, so redundant, that they could simply discard what would be a strategic windfall for their adversary? It was like trying to empty an ocean with a teacup. The irony was bitter, a metallic taste on his tongue. He, the commando who specialized in turning impossible situations into improbable victories, was now confronted with an impossibility that no amount of daring or ingenuity could overcome. This was a war against an economy, against a nation whose factories churned out planes, tanks, and fuel with an almost contemptuous ease, while Germany, in a state of total war, was reduced to scavenging crumbs from the enemy's table. The moral of the story was not about strategy or tactics. It was about the crushing weight of material reality. The sheer statistical disparity between the Allied and Axis powers, particularly the United States and Germany, became chillingly clear through the lens of that abandoned fuel depot. Consider the numbers. In 1944 alone, the United States produced roughly 100,000 aircraft, while Germany, under relentless bombing and facing critical resource shortages, managed only about 40,000. For tanks, the ratio was even more lopsided. Over 17,000 American tanks rolled off assembly lines in 1944, compared to fewer than 8,000 German tanks. And fuel, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, was where the chasm truly became unbridgeable. American oil production in 1944 was approximately 4.7 million barrels per day. Germany's, including synthetic production and occupied sources, peaked at around 130,000 barrels per day, a mere fraction. The 50,000 gallons Skorzeny seized, while significant to his beleaguered unit, represented less than half a day's output from just one American refinery. It was a statistical horror. These numbers, when viewed from the German perspective, were not merely statistics. They were an inexorable countdown to defeat. Every bombing raid on a German synthetic fuel plant, every convoy sunk in the Atlantic, tightened the noose. The German High Command, trapped in a narrative of ideological superiority and technological genius, consistently underestimated the industrial might arrayed against them. They saw the quality of their Panther tanks, the speed of their U-boats, the innovation of their V-weapons, and believed these could compensate for a severe quantitative deficit. But war, as Scorzani was now learning, was not just about quality. It was about overwhelming quantity, about the relentless accumulation of materiel until the enemy was simply crushed beneath its weight. The war was not being fought on the battlefield alone. It was being fought in the factories, in the oil fields, in the shipyards. And there, Germany had already lost. The fuel depot was merely a physical manifestation of this devastating truth. Scorzani's internal transformation was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, grinding realization born of repeated exposure to this overwhelming material superiority. The audacious commando, the man of action and improvisation, now found himself contemplating the prosaic, yet devastating realities of logistics. He watched as the salvaged fuel was distributed, knowing it was a temporary reprieve, a single drop in an ocean of need. His men, for a brief moment, had the luxury of fully fueled vehicles, but the broader picture remained bleak. His superiors, however, continued to speak of strategic retreats, of counteroffensives, of new wonder weapons that would turn the tide. Their words, once filled with conviction, now seemed increasingly hollow to Scorzani. He recalled the earlier campaigns, the blitzkriegs that had swept across Europe, fueled by captured resources and the initial technological edge. But those days were long gone. Now, every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every spare part was a precious commodity, fought over, salvaged, and stretched to its absolute limit. He began to see the war not as a series of heroic battles, but as an ever-tightening noose of supply lines, a struggle for resources that Germany was irrevocably losing. The narrative from Berlin of the steadfast German soldier facing down a decadent, materialistic enemy crumbled in the face of the truth. The Americans were materialistic, yes, but their materialism translated directly into an almost infinite capacity for war. Their factories produced, their ships delivered, their trucks transported, all with a relentless efficiency that made German efforts seem puny by comparison. This wasn't about courage or willpower. It was about tons of steel, gallons of oil, and millions of man-hours. Scorzani, the man who believed in the power of a few brave men to change the course of history, was now forced to confront the humbling reality that sometimes history is simply the inevitable outcome of overwhelming industrial output. The war, for him, was no longer a question of if it would end, but when the last barrel of German fuel would run dry. The memory of the fuel depot lingered, a silent indictment against every boast and every desperate gambit from Berlin. Scorzani found himself increasingly detached from the fervent, often delusional optimism of the High Command. When Hitler spoke of new armies emerging from the shattered ruins of the Reich, Scorzani thought of the empty fuel tanks, the grounded planes. When propaganda broadcasts promised ultimate victory, Scorzani saw the relentless columns of American trucks endlessly ferrying supplies to the front. The war had become an exercise in futility, a slow-motion catastrophe driven by an ideology that refused to acknowledge material reality. He continued to execute his missions with precision and daring, because that was his duty, but the burning conviction that had once fueled his actions had been replaced by a grim resignation. He observed the relentless American logistical machine with a mixture of grudging admiration and despair. Their P-51 Mustangs, fueled by 100-octane aviation gasoline, ranged far and wide, sweeping German skies clean. Their Sherman tanks, though individually inferior to the Panther or Tiger, were produced in such staggering numbers that they simply overwhelmed German defenses through sheer quantity. The supply lines, stretching from the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh across the Atlantic, then across France, were a testament to an organizational prowess that defied the logistical nightmares faced by Germany. The narrative of German technological superiority, once a source of national pride, now seemed a cruel joke. What good was a Tiger tank if it had no fuel, or if the single railroad line needed to transport it had been bombed into oblivion? What good was a jet fighter if its pilots lacked adequate training and its hangars lacked spare parts? The war was not lost because of a lack of courage or skill on the part of the German soldier. It was lost because of a fundamental, insurmountable difference in the ability to produce and sustain the modern instruments of war. The fuel depot for Skorzenny was more than just a place. It was a conceptual breach, a moment where the overwhelming truth of industrial power finally broke through the carefully constructed facade of Nazi propaganda. The psychological impact on the German forces, when confronted with the vast logistical superiority of the Allies, was profound, even if often unacknowledged in official reports. Small-scale incidents, like the discovery of the fuel depot, contributed to a growing sense of hopelessness among those on the front lines. Soldiers accustomed to scarcity, to constantly conserving every bullet and every drop of fuel, found themselves fighting an enemy who appeared to have an endless supply of everything. The contrast was stark and demoralizing. German soldiers would scavenge American battlefields not just for weapons, but for boots, rations, and even cigarettes, items that were luxuries in their own meager supply chain. They saw American soldiers discarding half-eaten meals, leaving behind perfectly serviceable equipment, a casualness born of abundance that was incomprehensible to the German mindset. This was not a clash of equals. It was a struggle between a nation at the peak of its industrial might and another, bled dry and starving for resources. The German war effort, which had started with a swift, decisive series of conquests fueled by pre-war reserves and the plunder of occupied territories, was now a slow, agonizing grind. The relentless Allied strategic bombing campaigns had systematically dismantled Germany's industrial capacity, targeting oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, and transportation networks. The men on the ground, like Skorzenny, saw the immediate effects: fewer tanks, fewer planes, fewer trucks, and critically, less fuel. The myth of German invincibility, nurtured by years of propaganda, began to unravel as the sheer weight of Allied material superiority pressed down upon them. This was a war of attrition, and Germany simply did not have the material to attrite. The war was already lost, not on a single battlefield, but in the vast, unseen factories and oil fields across the Atlantic. Skorzenny survived the war, a testament to his resourcefulness, but the lessons he learned during the Ardennes offensive stayed with him. In post-war interviews, he rarely spoke of tactical brilliance or individual acts of heroism. Instead, he often returned to the crushing reality of Allied industrial power. He recounted incidents like the fuel depot, not as a moment of triumph, but as a chilling preview of Germany's inevitable defeat. He had seen firsthand that a nation, no matter how ideologically driven or militarily skilled, could not win a prolonged conflict against an enemy whose productive capacity dwarfed its own. He spoke of the American way of war, not with disdain, but with a grudging respect born of utter defeat. It was a method of warfare that relied on overwhelming force, on endless supplies, on a relentless logistical machine that could simply outproduce and outsupply any foe. This understanding contrasted sharply with the romanticized notion of warfare prevalent in many German military circles, where individual bravery and tactical genius were often seen as sufficient to overcome material disadvantages. Skorzenny, the ultimate commando, the man of daring and unconventional tactics, ultimately came to understand that even the most audacious plan could be rendered irrelevant by the sheer weight of an enemy's industrial might. The war was lost, not in a single battle, but in the profound, unbridgeable gap between two economic systems. One, a centrally planned, resource-starved economy driven by ideology. The other, a vast free-market powerhouse capable of generating unprecedented quantities of everything needed for modern warfare. The ultimate irony was that it took seizing an enemy's abandoned fuel, an act meant to sustain a desperate offensive, for a man like Skorzenny to truly comprehend the insurmountable reality of their defeat. It was a truth delivered in 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, a truth that spelled the end of the Third Reich,